Hull sent a larger party under James Miller to clear his lines of communication and escort a supply convoy of 300 head of cattle and 70 pack horses loaded with flour, which was awaiting at Frenchtown, Michigan, under Major Bush. Miller forced a British and Indian force under Major Adam Muir of the 41st Regiment to retreat some distance at the Battle of Magwaga on August 9th, but the British reformed their line and he declined to resume the attack. Miller was ill, and his losses in the engagement were heavier than those of the enemy. He lost confidence and remained encamped near the battlefield until Hull ordered him to return to Detroit. Meanwhile, British Major General Isaac Brock was in York, the provincial capital, dealing with the unwilling legislative assembly, their politics, it's got to be hard, and mobilizing the province militia. He had only a single regiment of regulars and some small detachments of veterans and artillery to support the militia, but he was aware that there was no immediate threat from the disorganized and badly supplied American forces on the Niagara River, or from the lethargic American Commander-in-Chief, Major General Henry Dearborn, at Albany, New York. Hull's army alone was occupying or threatening Canadian territory. Late in July, Brock learned of the capture of Mackinac. He was also informed by Lieutenant General George Prevost, the Governor General of Canada, that an additional regiment was being dispatched to Upper Canada, although as piecemeal detachments. Brock dispatched 50 of his small force of regulars and 250 volunteers from the militia westward from York to reinforce Athensburg. On August, he prorogued the assembly and set out himself after them. He and his force sailed from Port Dover, Ontario, in bateaux and open boats. That's French. Amherstburg on the 13th of August, at the same time as 200 additional Indian warriors who joined Tecumseh, 100 Western Indians from Mackinac, and 100 Wyandots at Amherstburg. Brock learned from Hull's captured dispatches that the morale was low in Hull's army, that they feared the numbers of Indians which might be facing them, and that they were short of supplies. Brock also established a rapport with Tecumseh, ensuing that the Indians would cooperate with his moves. Brock and Tecumseh met shortly after Brock arrived at Amherstburg, and legend has it that Tecumseh turned to his warriors and said, "Here is a man." Brock wrote shortly afterwards, "A more sagacious and a more gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist." Brock determined on an immediate attack on Detroit, against the advice of most of his subordinates. The British had already played on Hull's fear of the Indians by arranging for a misleading letter to fall into American hands. The letter asked that no more Indians be allowed to proceed from Fort Mackinac, as there were already 5,000 at Amherstburg, and supplies were running short. Brock sent Hull a demand for surrender, stating the following: "The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join in the war of extermination, But you must be aware that the numerous bodies of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond the moment the contest commences. According to Brock's later report, the attacking force included 600 warriors and 1,300 soldiers, as well as 2 warships. Brock's force carried out several bluffs to deceive the Americans into believing that there were more Indians and troops than there actually were. Major Thomas Evans at Fort George suggested that Brock give his militia the cast-off uniforms of the 41st Regiment to make Hull believe that most of the British force were regulars. They were told to light individual fires instead of 1 fire per unit, thereby creating the illusion of a much larger army. They marched to take up positions in plain sight of the Americans, then quickly ducked behind entrenchments and marched back out of sight to repeat the maneuver. The same trick was carried out during meals, where the line would dump their beans into a hidden pot, then return out of view to rejoin the end of the line. The battle. On August 15th, gunners of the Provincial Marine set a battery of 1 18-pounder and 2 12-pounders and 2 mortars on the Canadian shore of the Detroit River in the grounds of the Francis Baby House, formerly Hull's headquarters, and bombarding Detroit, joined by the armed vessel General Hunter and the 20-gun sloop of war Queen Charlotte. In the early hours of the morning of August 16th, Tecumseh's warriors crossed the river about 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers, south of Detroit. They were followed after daybreak by Brock's force, divided into 3 small brigades. The first was composed of 50 men of the Royal Newfoundland Fencibles and some Lincoln and Kent militia. The second consisted of 50 men of the 41st Regiment with York, Lincoln, Oxford, and Norfolk militia. The third was formed of the Royal Artillery with... From the main body of the 41st. That's cut off. Thank you. One moment, please. Was formed of the main body of the 41st, 200 men, and 50 men of the Royal Artillery, with 5 field guns, 3 6-pounders, and 2 3-pounders. Elements of the Essex militia, which had been disheartened in the face of Hull's initial advance into Upper Canada, also constituted part of Brock's reinvigorated force. Brock originally intended to occupy a fortified position astride Hull's supply line and wait for starvation and bombardment to force the Americans to surrender or come out to fight. But he then learned that Hull had sent a detachment of 400 men the previous day under Colonel Cass and MacArthur to escort Brush's convoy to Detroit via a backwoods trail some distance from the lake and river. This detachment was only a few miles from the British rear. Hull had sent messengers recalling this force the night before, but Cass and MacArthur had already encamped for the night and declined to move. To avoid being caught between 2 fires, Brock advanced immediately against the rear of Fort Detroit, the side farthest from the river where the defenses were weakest. Tecumseh warriors, meanwhile, paraded several times past a gap in the forest where the Americans could see them while making loud war cries. Militia cavalry leader William Hamilton Merritt noted that Tecumseh extended his men and marched them 3 times through an opening in the woods at the rear of the fort in full view of the garrison, which induced them to believe that there were at least 2,000 or 3,000 Indians. Merritt was not an eyewitness, however, and this claim has been many disputed. As the British prepared to attack, a shell exploded in the officers' mess inside the fort, causing casualties. Hull despaired of holding out against a force which seemingly consisted of thousands of British regulars, because he was lacking adequate gunpowder and ammunition to withstand a long siege. A surrender would also save his 2,500 soldiers, 700 civilians, including his own daughter, from the horrors of an Indian massacre. Thus he wrote. Hull hosted a white flag of surrender against the advice of his subordinates. He sent messengers to Brock asking for 3 days to agree on terms of surrender. Brock replied that he would only allow him 3 hours. Hull surrendered his entire force, including Cass and MacArthur's detachment, and Major Brush's supply convoy. There were rumors that he had been drinking heavily prior to the surrender. At this point I should laugh. He is reported to have said that the Indians were numerous beyond example and more greedy of violence than the Vikings or the Huns. Casualties and losses. The British bombardment killed 7 Americans before the surrender, including Lieutenant Porter Hanks, the former commander of Fort Mackinac, who was awaiting a court-martial. The fire from the guns of Fort Detroit wounded 2 British gunners. After Hull surrendered, the 1,600 Ohio militiamen from his army were paroled and escorted south until they were out of danger of attack from the Indians. Most of the Michigan militia had already deserted. The 582 American regulars were sent as prisoners to Quebec City. Among the booty and military stores surrendered, there were 33 cannon, 300 rifles, 2,500 muskets, and the brig Adams, the only American vessel on the Upper Lakes. The British Navy put it into service, and it was briefly recaptured 2 months later near Fort Erie. An intense U.S. and British artillery barrage ensued, causing a fire that ultimately destroyed and the hulk. Aftermath. Hull's surrender was startling on both sides of the border. On the American side, many Indians took up arms and attacked American settlements and isolated military outposts. In Upper Canada, the population and militia were encouraged, particularly in the western districts where they had been threatened by Hull's army. Brock forgave the local militia for their reluctance to perform their duty, instead rewarding those militiamen who had remained at their post. More materially, yeah, that didn't sound right. The 2,500 muskets captured from Hull were distributed among the ill-equipped militia. The British gained an important post on American soil and won control over Michigan territory. The Detroit region for most of the following year was theirs. Brock was hailed as a hero, and Tecumseh's influence was strengthened over the Confederation of Indians. Brock next intended to mount a preemptive attack into New York State to forestall an American attack across the Niagara River. He was thwarted by an armistice arranged by Sir George Prevost. When this ended, the Americans attacked in October near Queenston, Ontario. Brock was killed at the ensuing Battle of Queenston Heights while leading a hasty counterattack to recover a battery which had been captured by the Americans. A third American invasion of Canada took place in November north of Lake Champlain. The Americans accidentally fired each other in then retreated after a brief engagement at Lacola Mills. The Vermont newspaper Green Mountain Farmer wrote in January 1813, "The Canadian campaign had produced nothing but disaster, defeat, disgrace, ruin, and death." General Hull was tried by court-martial and sentenced to death for his conduct at Detroit. But the sentence was commuted by President Madison to dismissal from the Army in recognition of his honorable service in the American Revolution. American attempts to regain Detroit were continually thwarted by poor communications and the difficulties of maintaining militia contingents in the field until the Americans won a naval victory at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. This isolated the British at Amherstburg and Detroit from their supplies and forced them to retreat. Hull's successor, Major General William Henry Harrison, pursued the retreating British and their Indian allies and defeated them at the Battle of Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. Memorials. The British 41st Regiment, which is now perpetuated by the Royal Welsh Regiment, was awarded the Battle Honour Detroit, one of the few to be awarded to British regiments for the War of 1812. The captured colors of the 4th U.S. Infantry are currently in the Welsh Regiment Museum at Cardiff Castle. The patriotic song, "The Bold Canadian," was written by a private on the campaign to commemorate conquering Detroit in Michigan Territory. 7 infantry, armored, and artillery regiments of the Canadian Army carry the Battle Honour Detroit to commemorate the service of ancestors units in the campaign. In 2012, the Royal Canadian Mint released a 25-cent coin depicting Tecumseh to mark the War of 1812's bicentennial. A bronze life statue was unveiled on September 7, 2018 in Sandwich Town, a neighborhood in Windsor, Ontario. It depicts Brock examining Detroit through a telescope while Tecumseh, mounted on horseback, is watching the British battery bombard the fort. The statue commemorates the partnership between the two leaders, which resulted in the capture of Detroit, and was sculpted by Canadian Mark Williams, who also created the Provincial Marine Monument at the King's Navy Yard in Amherstburg.